Welcome to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Miley, an IFS-informed certified trauma recovery coach. This show features interviews from survivors all over the world as they share their impactful story of thriving in their post-traumatic growth. We explore resources, tools, and coping skills to support the trauma survivor community. Enjoy. All right, so welcome back to the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. I'm your host, Sarah. I have with us today Ed Cohen. At 13, Ed was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is a chronic, incurable condition that nearly killed him in his early 20s. At his diagnosis, his doctor told him that the best he could hope for would be periods of remission. Unfortunately, doctors never mentioned that healing was even a possibility. His new book, On Learning to Heal, he draws on 50 years of learning to live with Crohn's to consider how Western medicine turned from the art of healing, turning to the science of medicine, and how that deeply affects both the practitioners and their patients. He demonstrates that although medicine can now offer many seemingly miraculous therapies, medicine is not and has never been the only way to enhance healing. So he explores his own path to healing, and he argues that learning to heal requires us to desire and value healing as even a vital possibility. So in his book, he advocates reviving healing's role for all those whose lives are touched by chronic illness. Ed Cohen is a professor of women's and gender and sexuality studies at Rutgers, and he's the author of A Body Worth Defending. He also is published in Duke University Press, and he hosts therapeutic practice for people that are interested at healingcounsel.com. Ed, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'm excited to have this conversation because I feel like the world doesn't talk enough about medical trauma and the trauma of chronic illness. So I'm glad that you're here. How was that like for you and your family coping with this, especially when you were young? Obviously, you got your diagnosis at 13, but you must have been ill for a long time before it came to that. So what was that like with you and your family coping through that?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sarah, for having me. And well, yes, there was, so I'm sure I was getting sick for a while before I became acutely ill, but the climax happened on a cross-country trip with my family in our dark blue unair-conditioned station wagon in 1972, where my parents, my two younger brothers, and my cousin, who was a year older than me, were all packed in this station wagon, driving across country. And having diarrhea in a station wagon, unair-conditioned station wagon on a cross-country trip where rest areas are few and far between really is an interesting experience. You learn a lot about time. Yeah. And the way that time is not, segments, equal segments distributed over a line that moves in a direction. I mean, it dilates incredibly when you're holding onto your sphincters for dear life.
Yes, and it's painful too, correct?
It is, yes. Yeah. And so we were on this cross-country trip, and basically, my parents did notice something was happening, and they did take me to like an emergency room where they like threw some of those like chalky anti-diarrhea medicines at me, but nothing really seemed to work. And the main imperative was really for us to get across the country and get back. And so it was a very intense, like 2-month journey. And when we arrived back on the East Coast, and we arrived at my grandmother's house to drop off my cousin, my grandmother opened the door and she started screaming because I'd lost so much weight and I was so wasted that, clearly something was wrong. So after that, I started going to a lot of doctors. That was the beginning of the doctoring. So I spent the fall of 1972 in the hospital. And again, today things are, that was 50 years ago. So, things are slightly more advanced now, although in terms of what medicine can actually do about Crohn's disease. It's pretty much the same. I mean, they can maybe diagnose a little bit quicker than they did, and they have a little bit better medications that have fewer side effects. But really, the treatment is still the same as it was then, which is immunosuppression. So, after doing all of these tests, which, as I like to say, left no orifice unprobed, it was a teaching hospital. So the team came into my room to make their announcement. It's sort of like if you watch, those home renovation shows like HGTV, where they do the reveal. That's how I think of it. They did the reveal. So they revealed to me that they thought I have Crohn's disease. And then they tried to explain it to me. And they said, well, Crohn's is an incurable autoimmune illness. And, I was 13. I mean, I had a big vocabulary, but autoimmunity wasn't one of my words. So then they tried to explain it to me. And so they first said, well, it's like you're allergic to yourself. And that was really not that helpful. And then they said, well, it's like you're rejecting part of yourself. Again, not super helpful. So finally they said, well, it's like you're eating yourself alive. Okay, yes, I understood that one. Never a good thing to say to anyone, certainly not to an acutely ill child. Yes, no, not good. And then immediately I was put on very, very high doses of prednisone. So today, many people have taken prednisone. Prednisone is an amazing drug. It is, it's one of the earliest. It was developed in the 1950s. It's still used for everything from, acute allergy attacks, poison ivy, to brain tumors. And I mean, it's an all-purpose, immunosuppressant. But if you've ever had the joy of being on prednisone, you also know there's a lot of side effects. And unfortunately, they didn't bother to tell me any of the side effects. And this is before, drugs.com. Like now you just go online and you type in prednisone and you see this giant list of, of side effects. Which, some of which are physical, which I have many of. I mean, at the time, I had unbelievable weight gain. I had the cushoid face. I had thin skinning. But the most significant things were the psychological things, which of course they didn't bother to tell me about. So prednisone causes mood swings, depression, anxiety. All of which I had, but nobody seemed to think it was a problem because I was an adolescent. So they just thought, it's adolescent. So now I think of this as my adolescence on steroids. Right? It's just like crazy. So basically I lived like that for 10 years on very high doses of prednisone and, with basically a pharmaceutically induced mental illness. But I managed. I did it very well. I'm a capable, smart person. I did very well in high school. I did very well in college. Went and got my PhD at Stanford. And when I was in my second year of graduate school, first and second year, I started getting really acutely ill, and they were throwing more prednisone at it. Now there are these what are called the monoclonal antibodies, the so-called biologics, which seem to be somewhat more efficacious and have somewhat less side effects. But they didn't exist then, right? So so I was on high doses of prednisone, and I just kept getting sicker. So things were normal in the sense of like my normal acute illness for a while. But at a certain point, one day I was actually at the movies watching Disney's Tron, and I knew something was not good, and I rushed home just in time to pass out on the bathroom floor with like blood gushing out of my rectum, where then my my roommates found me on the floor, called the ambulance, took me to the hospital, and there, they did, more testing, like every kind of test you could do in those days, and they still couldn't find anything because what happened was there was an abscess on the outside of my small bowel on a blood vessel. So, now maybe the imaging technology is better, but at the time they couldn't really visualize it. So they didn't really know what was going on. But then I had another bleed out and I got rushed to the hospital again. And this time they put me in, and then I started spiking these high fevers. So they knew there was something really messed up. And so I was supposed to be having exploratory surgery to, find out what's going on. And unfortunately, before that could happen, I had a massive bleed out. So they couldn't stop the bleeding. They were pumping blood and fluids into me. And I started having one of those out of body near death kind of things. So I'm up there hovering and, and I'm seeing everything going on. And people are like, frantically doing, and I knew something was off because, like, at the time, I wasn't really a super calm person, and especially, I've been on the prednisone, but I'm in this place. I'm like, wow, this is like, yeah. So I knew something was going on, and eventually they stabilized me enough to rush me to surgery. And the last thing I remember, literally, they're pushing me on the gurney down the hallway to the emergency room. And I'm flying above the gurney, looking down, seeing, the nurses like holding the bags of blood and sailing because there's like, and, pushing it to the emergency room. Next thing I knew, I woke up in the ICU. I'd had a small bowel resection. It turned out my liver was completely abscessed. So I ended up spending a couple of months, and this was the olden days. So they still let you stay in the hospital, Now I don't know what they would have done, But yeah, I had to be on all of these IV antibiotics, and I had to be weaned off the prednisone, which I'd been on for a very long time, because prednisone impairs impairs tissue repair. So neither of those is a good thing. Having them together, not even worse. But having all that going on when you're really sick and trying to get better, that was a challenging moment. But it turned out to be a really great moment because for some reason, which nothing in my experience ever prepared me for this, because I grew up in a family. As I said, my father was a physical chemist, my mother was a communist. They were both atheist Jews. There was like no spirituality in our life. It was matter was all that mattered. It was all that. So, but I started sort of spontaneously going into trances. I could listen to music and then kind of go into this realm where there was like this light, and I could take the light and kind of mold it and pack it around the places in my abdomen that were, it was basically, I thought, pain management, right? That was all I was doing. I just thought, okay, this is like a damper, I can do this. And then once I would do that, then I could just fall into this place that was like incredibly like peaceful. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever spent time in a hospital. It's not peaceful. That's not a word. I mean, there's many things about a hospital, but peaceful, not one. So for me, it was great. At first, it kind of freaked the nurses out because they'd come into my room and it looked like I was dead to the world. Like, and that didn't bode well for them. No. But then they figured out that if I was listening to music, they could just shut up the music and then I'd come out of it. So nobody really thought anything about it. And I didn't think anything about it for sure, until finally, when I was released from the hospital, I had an exit interview with my surgeon. And he said this thing to me that, kind of seared itself into my brain. And he said, you're the sickest person I've operated on in 5 years who's still alive. And I don't know how you got better so quickly. Wow. And both of those things kind of blew me away. I mean, the you're the sickest person who's still alive. I mean, I knew I had this experience, but I didn't think of it as an out of body near death. I was 22. I wasn't like thinking. I just thought, this is Crohn's. But so that kind of shattered my denial about how sick I'd been. But the second part, like, I don't know how you got better so quickly. That really struck me because, well, first of all, it was the first time I ever heard a doctor say, I don't know. So that was already a thing. But I was like, well, okay, well, they knew a lot about the illness, but how come they didn't know anything about the healing? Like, why is that not a thing? so, and then when I got out of the hospital, needless to say, it was a, big transitional period. And I had a very surprising to me, because as I said, I grew up with the militant atheist, moment where I was in a woods, and it was like something came up from the ground. I don't know, it was like the trees were speaking to me. I don't know. I mean, but I got a really clear message that said, okay, you can keep living the way you were living before, and you'll probably have to go through things like this again, or you can learn some new ways to be. And I was like, I think I'll choose option number 2. And really it's like a very vivid moment. I know, and that really was like this like dividing line in my life. And fortunately, once I made that choice, it was like suddenly all these doors open, like suddenly teachers and who I never would have been interested in, came into my life. And I mean, it just started this journey that I've been on for the last 40 years. And I am super healthy. I just actually went to a gastroenterologist for the first time in 25 years. Because, basically after all of this medical stuff, I really didn't want to keep doing that. And she was great, actually, I have to say. I mean, I've been to many, many doctors, and she was fabulous. But she was like, oh, you have done bad. You're great. Like, I see people all the time. I mean, one of my, this thing, I have so many coincidences. So when I was in graduate school at Stanford, one of my best friends, her father, Henry Janowitz, was Dr. Crohn's protege. He and Dr. Crohn wrote the famous article about Crohn's disease. It was called Regional Enteritis. He had Dr. Crohn's office. He had Dr. Crohn's desk. I mean, I would go to see him. And Henry said to me, you've done better than 99.9% of the people I've ever treated. So clearly something happened. And it was something that I take no responsibility for. It was just sort of, and that really made me think, well, why don't we know about this capacity? I mean, it's not something that I knew about to begin with. No doctor ever mentioned it to me. I'm not special because, I didn't, when I was going into trances, I had no idea that this was having a healing effect. I just thought, I'm damping down the pain, right? So, really pushed me to begin to inquire, well, why doesn't medicine know about this? And especially since, for more than 2,000 years, I mean, medicine was that in the way that we think about it, well, as medicine was first invented in the 5th century BCE. And for 2,000 years, basically, or more, medicine's job, its role was to support and encourage the natural power of healing. That's what medicine did. And it really was only at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century when medicine has, tried to become more scientific and less of an art. And when we say scientific, what we really are talking about is biochemical reductionism, like that everything about what we are as living organisms can be explained, in terms of, cellular, molecular, subatomic, quantum vibrational, whatever, materiality, right? Yeah. And, which obviously it is. I mean, we are that, I just actually was saying to my graduate students yesterday, we like to think of ourselves, we like to think that we have a body. Like that's the way that in Western culture, we think to be a person means to have a body. But what's a body? What's the body? There's no the body. I mean, a much more accurate way in biochemical reductionist terms of thinking about what we call a body is we're transformations of matter energy localized in space-time. Right? We're events, we're processes, we're in constant transformation. Yeah. So so the capacity to go on living, is something that we have an intrinsic ability to do until we don't. Like we go on living until we don't. And medicine's very good. Like one of my main things to say, I'm not against medicine. I'm very thankful that I'm still alive. I would be dead on a number of occasions without medicine. But there's certain aspects of medicine that have become limits on the way that we imagine what our intrinsic capacities are. And, and it's not all on medicine either. I mean, we do it. Like we give over that power. Like when we go to a physician, we hope that they know something about us that we don't know, right? Their job is we go to them as the people who are supposed to know, right? Which puts a lot of pressure on them because then they're supposed to know, like that's and we suppose that they'll know. We desire that they'll know something, and so we tend, to address their authority in certain kinds of ways that are not necessary in terms of, having access to the resources that they can provide us. Right. I mean, certainly, Dr. Google has, changed that a little bit. I mean, now everybody self-diagnoses and, but we still, when we go to the doctor, we still want them to, do that for us. And so basically, what I went through is I went through this long arc where I had no idea that healing could happen. I totally was that person who wanted my doctors to, save my life. I mean, that was for sure. And I, was highly medicated through adolescence and early adulthood. And then I had a radical experience that made me think, maybe there are some limits to this. As powerful as there are, maybe there's some limits, and maybe there's some other things I can do. And it turns out, yes, that's true.
First of all, you were in great places at the right times, right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
that was obviously very helpful. The journey there, I'm just really curious, this trance music thing that you were doing in the hospital, is this, was this exploration where you've had, other, psychedelic exploratory stuff? Was this maybe because of the, something you read in a book? Did you see it in a TV show? Was it maybe because of the near-death out-of-body experience that happened? How did that happen? Were you consciously thinking about what you were doing, or it just happened?
No, it just happened. I mean, obviously, I want to say I was on drugs.
Well, right. Yes, of course.
So
Of course.
I was in some, biochemically altered state. I don't even know. But yes, I've had, yes, I subsequently, I have had the ability, I have developed the ability to access some aspects of that experience in a lot of different ways. Psychedelics is certainly one, and that is, very powerful. But I also spend a lot of time doing various kinds of body work and movement exercises, meditation, and or even just like being in the world in different kinds of ways, being in relationship to nature. I mean, there's lots of ways that we can augment our intrinsic capacity to heal. I mean, healing is a capacity of every living organism since the first cell that sprang into existence. I mean, when biologists try to talk about what are the characteristics that define something as a living organism, they say, okay, organisms have to be bounded, but the boundaries have to be permeable. We have to be able to take in nutrients. We have to be able to let out toxins. Organisms have to reproduce themselves in time. And they also have to have a reparative function. Those are like the basic characteristics of all living beings. So it's not that we're special, in our capacity to heal, but what we are perhaps adapted to do because, somehow we have developed consciousness and the capacity for self-reflection, maybe through language or whatever, but that we can reflect on that capacity. And, and that's why, at the beginning when you were saying about my work, it's like, and we can recognize that if we desire it and value it, then we can support it and encourage it. And basically, that's what I want to share with people from my own experience. And that's what I do in my therapeutic practice.
What I want to draw on there is what you said about the intrinsic nature of healing and this capacity that has to lie within yourself, right? And I want to just draw back on what you were talking about with this idea of not removing your past, right? Not even curing totally, because to bring it into my world as a trauma recovery coach, we're never just erasing what happened. You can't just move on. You don't just, someone dies, you're grieving, you move on. You get abused, you're assaulted, you move on. It's moving forward though with what happened to you. So I love that you said that, because even if it's been, a medical situation, a complication, a chronic illness, like you have to learn how to move forward with it, not just cure it and be done, because so many of these things are chronic and uncurable, and you just have to learn either management skills or, like you're saying, this art of healing. And I think it's beautiful. On your site, I just want to read that you said we can learn to appreciate the healing process. Is that true for trauma survivors as well? And why is it so important to actually appreciate the process?
So I would say, well, okay, trauma is a very capacious category. It can include things that are physical. I mean, actually, in the history of thinking about trauma, and war trauma was sort of the basis for that. And then within, say, psychoanalysis or psychodynamic thinking, I mean, trauma is often considered to be an experience that's not assimilable. Like it becomes a kind of a node like that is not metabolizable in the process, and therefore is so the way that I often think about it is it's kind of like the past that endures in the present in really palpable ways. And and my belief about it, I mean, so I was sexually abused when I was 3, and which I'm sure has something to do with my illness and everything, but
Probably, yeah.
So, I mean,
I've done a lot of shows on the links between chronic illness and trauma, for sure. Yeah.
So I've done a million years of therapy, and and one of the things about that I would say about it is, like, I came to this belief a long time ago, and I share it with my students and my clients all the time, is that things that are done to us. So when we say trauma, it's usually something that comes at us from without and then lodges within. And my feeling is we're not responsible for things that are done to us, in the sense of we didn't cause them to happen. It wasn't, some kind of valuation of our worth as a being or anything like that. But as we said, but because it resides in us, we're responsible to it, in the sense of we need to try to heal in that regard, in part, if only to not keep passing it along to others. Right. And so that's why the process of healing, I mean, my personal belief is, like, I think life is a healing process. Like that's and that's a value decision that I choose as my ethos. It's like, I'm going to live as if. I don't know if it's true. Nobody gave me a bulletin from God, but I'm gonna try to live as if that were the case, because I've discovered that if I live as if healing is an ongoing process, then all of these things that seem to come at me from the outside, of course, many things, I've had many traumatic things happen to me, apart from illness. I mean, my mother was killed, all the whatever. But by having the ethical, let's call it ethical orientation towards healing, and holding the possibility, even when it feels like, no, this is not a healing thing. This is a horrible, terrible thing that the universe has, like, dumped on me in some way. But if I can hold to the place that at some point I might be able to understand that this will have been an opportunity. It doesn't have to feel like it now. I could hate it now. I can refuse it now. But if part of me holds, that it's the future interior. This will have been an occasion for me to learn something new, to learn how to expand, to grow, to develop, to be more capable, to be more of who I am, then that will, enable me to go on living in ways that I feel are more congruent with who I want to become.
I subscribe to that personal ethos as well. So that is a big part of my mantra, is that healing is possible. Finding the space and the capacity to do that is definitely, it's a daily practice. It's definitely a practice. It's nothing that you're going to get really good at and suddenly it's just going to happen. It is an ongoing, I call it a labyrinth, especially for trauma recovery, because you're never going to cannot be linear.
No.
It has to be wiggled and dead ends and over there and diagonal and back 10 spaces and forward 3. And it's a big maze, but it is an ongoing process. So I appreciate you for saying that and for recognizing that. You talk about, so I want to be able to talk about your practice and your book. So let's just dig into your practice first, because you say that your counsel is kind of more of like compassionate conversations, which I absolutely love. That as a coach, using coaching as my modality, that very much aligns with what I do. So what does that look like for you when you're doing your work with your clients?
Well, compassionate conversation. So I picked both of those words. They mean a lot. Compassion means feeling with, etymologically. Conversation is something that, again, I I like words. I'm like, obviously, I've been talking incessantly. But conversation is a word that we use all the time and we don't know where it comes from. Con is a prefix that means with. And then the versation, verso means to turn around, to turn with, to turn about. So invert, revert, devert, those are all the verse. So conversation is a way of being together, because it's a with, in which those who are involved in conversing are turned together. All of the participants in a compassionate conversation are changed in the process. When I work with people, I don't assume that I know anything about what their healing is. That really is their birthright. What I bring to a compassionate conversation is precisely my faith that healing is a possibility. And when people, I always assume that if people are attracted to working with me, that that's a sign that there's some aspect of healing within them that wants support and encouragement.
Sure, yeah. They found you, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so what I try to do is to hold that for them when they can't hold it for themselves.
That is great. So your new book, it's called On Learning to Heal, and I love the subtitle where it says, "Or What Medicine Doesn't Know." This is out now. Tell us about this book. Who's it for?
So the book is for people. Well, it's for everyone. Yes, I was hoping it would be a bestseller. No, I mean, but it is for people who have encounters with medicine, either themselves or others. Where we do know that medicine can be a valuable resource in many kinds of ways, but many of us have the experience of being disappointed or frustrated by the ways that medicine is practiced. And it's not the fault of doctors. I mean, the whole way in which medicine is structured as a fee for service, and the idea that it's a for-profit. I mean, to me, that's nuts. I mean, I have just like, that's my bias. It's like supporting healing should not be a profit generating enterprise, right? But anyway, but it is. And as a result, there are really structural limits on what physicians are allowed to do, what they're capable of doing. So the book is written for people who have experiences with medicine to try to explain why medicine came to be the way it is now. So that's the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book looks at other kinds of practices, modalities that I have been lucky enough to learn about and to participate in that actually, let's say, supplement or provide kind of alternative possibilities that I think have been highly helpful to me, and also redress some of the limitations that have become, kind of embedded within medical practice insofar as it's institutionalized, it's financialized, it's run, controlled by the insurance industries, all of which have nothing to do with healing.
Right. Wow. Powerful. That's really powerful. I love this, and I'm going to jump into our final question before I let you tell everyone how to get in contact with you. But in your healing journey, so you've talked about different modalities, and a lot of these sound like they're laid out in the book. But in your healing journey, I mean, you're talking about sexual abuse and loss and grief, and obviously all of this medical trauma of having a chronic illness. What has been helpful, except for you've already noted your million years in therapy. Besides going to therapy for millions of years, what was really helpful in clearing that headspace and having that good emotional and mental health well-being for yourself?
Well, I found really great teachers. I was really, really lucky. Right at the very beginning, when I got out of the hospital after I had almost died and I was having this prednisone withdrawal, which no one bothered to tell me about, I was fortunately led to an amazing person, Rachel Remen. I don't know if you know her work, but she is amazing. She's two international bestseller books. One's called Kitchen Table Wisdom, and another is called Blessings My Grandfather Gave Me. And Rachel is a physician. She was a pediatric endocrinologist at Stanford Hospital, and she also herself has Crohn's disease. She's like 15, 20 years older than me. So she got diagnosed when she was 16. And at a certain point, the tension between being a patient and being a physician became too great for her to continue practicing in the hospital. So she set up a practice for people with chronic and life-threatening illnesses, and as she calls them, recovering doctors. And I was like one of the very first people who went to her when she started this practice. I mean, subsequently, as I said, she's an internationally famous person. She co-founded the Commonweal, which is a comprehensive cancer care center in Bolinas, California. She was a clinical professor at UCSF Medical School. She started a course called the Healer's Art that's now taught in like 80 to 100 medical schools around the world. So she was the first teacher. And it was amazing to go to a doctor who had Crohn's, so that completely, changed my life. She, was an amazing teacher. And then she opened me up to going to other teachers. And one of the things, because I'd grown up with this chronic illness and had my adolescence on steroids, my experience of embodiment was not so happy. So she encouraged me to try out different kinds of modalities of somatic education. And that was really helpful. I did Feldenkrais. I once became a practitioner. I've been a practitioner of a practice called Continuum that was founded by Emily Conrad and Susan Harper, and it's an amazing movement, meditation, breath practice. So, I'm a fan of whatever works for you, actually. Find modalities that speak to you. There's a lot of different possibilities. Be open to them, and to notice, like, when you make a choice, when you think, okay, I'm going to try this, then look around, pay attention to what's offering itself to you. Because what I can say is, like, I didn't know in advance that any of these things would be things that would mean so much and make such a difference. But they presented themselves to me, and I said, oh, well, okay, let me be curious.
Yeah.
So I guess, if I was going to say one like short thing about, I would say just be curious.
Yeah. Just be curious. That's great. Well, that sounds like a great place for us to wrap up. Ed Cohen, thank you so much for being here today. Tell people where they can find you on the socials, plug your website, and where they can find their book.
Yes. So my book on learning to heal, or what medicine to know, you can find it anywhere. It's a trade book. But you can also find it on my website, healingcouncil.com. I'm not very good on the socials. I'm old. But if you go to my website, you can get in touch with me. Yeah, if you email me through the contact page, I'm happy to talk to you. I offer people like a 15-minute just chat if you want to see if it's something that you're interested in doing. And otherwise, yeah, I won't give you my academic stuff, but I'm on Google. You can Google me.
Yeah. We'll Google you. We know how to use the Google. Socials,
Yeah.
not so much. Google's easy. Ed, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful and enlightening conversation. I appreciate it very much. And I'm going to have everything linked up in the show notes below for our listeners and our viewers on YouTube and on the pod. And we just appreciate you. Have a great rest of your day.
Oh, thank you. It's been lovely. It's lovely
You're
to meet
welcome. All right. Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to or watching this episode of the Trauma Survivorhood podcast. Please subscribe, like, share, and follow. For any information that was discussed in this podcast episode, check out the show notes below. Until next time, be well.